It was a typical morning in Willowbrook, Wisconsin. Or so it seemed. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting a gentle golden hue across the small town. The streets, though quiet, carried the soft sounds of a waking community. People leaving their homes to begin the usual routine. Children were heading to school, the school bus whizzing by with its familiar rattle, while mothers and fathers sipped coffee on their porches, exchanging the day's first words with neighbors. It was a place where nothing unusual ever happened. A town where time moved slowly, and every day felt like a continuation of the last. But even on such a calm morning, there was something different in the air, something unsettling that no one could quite pinpoint. It was subtle at first. Perhaps it was the way the wind blew a little colder than usual, or how the birds in the trees seemed to be strangely quiet. Maybe it was just the odd feeling people got when they walked through the empty streets, or the fact that despite it being a new day, the usual cheerfulness of Willowbrook seemed to have disappeared overnight. First, no one thought much of it. It was just the normal humdrum of small-town life, quiet, uneventful. But things quickly started to change. It was the odd things that started to happen. People who had lived in Willowbrook their entire lives began acting strange. Mild at first, these changes were easy to dismiss. People stumbling as they walked, eyes glazed over as if lost in thought. But the behavior grew increasingly erratic. It wasn't just one person either. It was happening to several of them. And soon, the whole town seemed to be affected. One by one, residents who had never been seen before, wandering in the streets, began to shuffle around like sleepwalkers, eyes wide open but unseeing. They moved with an eerie mechanical slowness, as though they had forgotten how to function like normal people. Neighbors tried to approach them, but they received only vacant stares or inaudible murmurs in response. And when they spoke, their voices were hollow, distant, as though the people they once were had been completely drained away. Something was terribly wrong. At first, the local doctor, Dr. Matthews, dismissed it as some kind of flu or virus. Willowbrook wasn't a place where anything particularly dangerous ever came through. Maybe it was just a bad cold that was making people sluggish, disoriented, and weak. But as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. People were getting sick, but not just sick in the usual way. Something was changing them. They began to wander the streets more often, aimlessly. They stopped responding to familiar voices, and sometimes their movements seemed unnatural. They no longer walked as normal people did. Instead, they shuffled, dragging their feet with a strange, slow rhythm. Then came the attacks. It started with a local farmer named Earl. He had a small farm on the outskirts of town. where he raised sheep and cattle. It was a peaceful life, a simple one. Earl was used to the routine of feeding his animals in the morning and tending to the farm. But that morning, something was off. As Earl walked to the sheep pen, he felt a twinge of unease that he couldn't shake. The air was thicker somehow, and there was an odd silence that had settled over the land. He shook it off, dismissing it as nerves, and continued his work. But when he reached the pen, what he saw made his stomach turn. His sheep, which had always been healthy and lively, were lying dead in the pen. The air was thick with the smell of blood. Some of the sheep's bodies had been torn apart with an unnatural force. The flesh was shredded, their insides spilling out in grotesque displays. But it wasn't just that. They had been mutilated in ways Earl had never seen before. The wounds weren't from a predator, not from any animal he knew. The injuries were too clean, too deliberate. He could see claw marks on the bodies, but the force behind them was something no animal in the area could produce. As Earl scanned the pen, he noticed something even worse. There in the corner, crouching over the remains of a sheep, was a man. Someone he knew. It was Tom, a neighbor who lived down the road. Earl's heart stopped. He couldn't believe his eyes. Tom, with blood dripping from his mouth, was hunched over the dead sheep, gnawing on its flesh like a wild animal. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and filled with a madness that Earl had never seen before. There was no recognition in his eyes, no sign of the man Earl had known. He was gone, replaced by something else. Earl stood frozen for a moment, too shocked to act. But then, the sounds of the other animals, terrified, shrill cries, broke through his trance. He turned to look at his cattle, and it hit him. His worst nightmare was coming true. Tom wasn't alone. From behind him, the sound of shuffling footsteps reached his ears. He spun around, only to see several other figures emerging from the woods, slowly moving towards him. They were all people he knew, all familiar faces, but their movements were wrong. Their eyes were empty, their mouths drooling with hunger. Earl didn't hesitate any longer. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, back toward his house, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a disease. This wasn't a flu. That night, the town of Willowbrook descended into chaos as Earl barricaded himself inside his house, trying to keep the infected at bay. Other residents had begun to notice the changes. People were turning. They were becoming something else, something violent, something monstrous. It wasn't just a few people. The entire town was being overrun. Screams echoed through the streets as the first wave of attacks began. People were dragged from their homes, attacked in the streets. The infected, those who had once been their friends, their family members, were now mindless killers, driven only by hunger. It wasn't just random. They were organized, moving together as if they were controlled by some unseen force. Willowbrook, a quiet town once filled with life, had become a war zone. People fought back with whatever they had, but the terror was too much. There was no stopping the wave of violence that had swept through their town. As Earl lay trembling in his home, he realized something terrible. The infection was not just spreading in Willowbrook, it was spreading across Wisconsin. The infected had come, and there was nowhere left to hide. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town of Willowbrook, the peaceful, sleepy streets had descended into full chaos. The once quiet homes were now fortified fortresses, doors barricaded with furniture, windows covered with anything people could find to block out the horrors outside. The air, once filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional car passing by, was now eerily silent, interrupted only by distant screams. The people of Willowbrook, once trusting and calm, now cowered in their homes, their hearts pounding with fear. They had been through countless storms, power outages, and small-town troubles, but nothing had prepared them for the nightmare unfolding outside their doors. Their once peaceful neighbors had turned into monstrous creatures, their vacant eyes and groaning moans sending waves of terror through anyone who dared to look outside. The infected, slow and lifeless at first, had started to move with an eerie purpose, no longer aimlessly wandering the streets. They were hunting now. The first wave of chaos had been disorienting. People had tried to fend off the attackers, but most weren't prepared for what was happening. The few who had survived the initial onslaught had retreated into their homes, locking themselves away from the carnage. Now, as nightfall set in, the town was a ghost town, except inside her small house, Claire, a local high school teacher, could barely keep her nerves in check. She had heard the rumors, seen the strange behavior in her students that morning, but the full weight of the horror had only truly set in when she'd watched her neighbor, Mrs. Thomas, stumble out of her house with blood on her hands. She had been standing there, staring at Claire through the window, her vacant eyes wide and unblinking, as if she was unaware of anything at all. Then, with a now, hours later, the house felt suffocating. Claire hadn't heard from her husband, Daniel, since he had gone out to the store earlier that afternoon. He'd said he'd be back soon, but that was hours ago. The town was no longer safe, and she hadn't heard from him in over 4 hours. The radio was filled with static, the broadcast too corrupted to understand, and her phone had no signal. The world had changed in the blink of an eye. She didn't know what had happened or how it had spread so fast, but all she knew was that something had gone horribly wrong. Her mind raced with worries. Was Daniel safe? Was he stuck out there, unable to make it back? Claire clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. She couldn't sit in this house and wait for things to get worse. She had to find him. The thought of stepping outside into the chaos of the streets was terrifying. She glanced at the door, her eyes landing on the kitchen knife she had placed on the counter. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. She grabbed it and tucked it into the waistband of her jeans, her hands shaking. The fear of leaving the safety of her home, the uncertainty of the night ahead, gnawed at her. But she had no choice. Daniel was out there, and she had to find him. She paced the house once more, her gaze constantly flickering toward the windows. Outside, the sounds of the infected were growing louder. Deep, guttural growls, the unmistakable sound of flesh being torn apart. It wasn't just one or two screams anymore. It was chaos, everywhere, all around her. The streets were alive with the horrifying sounds of the undead. It was impossible to tell how many there were, but Claire knew they weren't just wandering. In the dim light of the setting sun, Claire packed her small bag with what little she could gather: water, canned food, a flashlight, and a few other necessities. She grabbed the keys to her car, but she had a sinking feeling that driving was out of the question. If she was going to make it out, she'd have to go on foot. It was safer that way. The streets were too unpredictable now. With a final glance around the house, at the family photos on the wall, the untouched couch, the mess of unwashed dishes in the sink, she stepped outside into the nightmare. The cool night air hit her face, but there was no comfort in it. The familiar streetlights that had once lit her way home now felt alien, their dim glow casting long shadows across the empty streets. The only sound was the soft creak of the wind and the far-off, unnerving groans of the infected. It was quiet now. Too quiet. The town that had once been bustling with life now felt hollow, like a Claire's heart raced as she moved cautiously down the street. She stayed close to the houses, keeping to the shadows as much as possible, hoping that the undead were too preoccupied with their hunger to notice her. Her eyes scanned every corner, every alley, as she made her way toward the store. She tried to keep a steady pace, but fear was creeping in. Every creak of a nearby branch, every distant thud, made her jump. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she might find when she reached the store. What had happened to Daniel? Was he trapped inside, fighting for his life? Or was he already? No, she couldn't think like that. She couldn't afford to. If she lost hope, she'd lose everything. The town felt suffocating as she crept past abandoned cars. Some overturned, others left in a rush. Windows were shattered and doors were wide open, some hanging off their hinges as though someone or something had been in a hurry to leave. The streets, once so familiar, now looked like the aftermath of a war zone. The peaceful, idyllic town Claire had known her whole life had turned into a nightmare, and there was no going back. The distant growls of the undead were growing louder as she neared the store. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't see anything, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She was getting close now. Too close. She pushed forward, trying to be as quiet as possible. Her heart beat wildly in her chest, and the sound seemed deafening in the otherwise silent night. As she reached the store, she took a deep breath and approached the front door. The windows were cracked, the glass splintered. Claire reached for the handle, but the door was locked. She let out a quiet sigh of relief. At least the building wasn't overrun yet. But as she peered through the broken glass, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The store was dark, except for the faint light filtering through the cracks. And then, out of the shadows, she saw him, Daniel. He was standing near the back, his back turned to her, seemingly unaware of her presence. She stepped forward, her heart leaping in her chest. "Daniel," she whispered urgently. "Daniel, it's me. It's Claire." But as he turned slowly toward her, she saw his face. His eyes were wide, but they were vacant, lifeless. The man she had married, the man she had spent years building a life with, was now standing. Her heart stopped. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. The last shred of hope that had kept her moving had been ripped away in an instant. The man she loved, the man she'd been desperately trying to find, was gone. The next morning, Willowbrook was unrecognizable. The town that had once been so familiar, so alive with the ordinary rhythm of daily life, had been turned into a nightmare. The streets that were once lined with picket fences and blooming flower beds now lay in ruins. Houses, some of which had stood for generations, were now reduced to smoldering piles of rubble and ash. Windows were shattered, the glass scattered across the pavement like broken promises. Cars were abandoned, some overturned, others blocking the road, as if everyone had tried to flee in a panic, only to be stopped by something far worse than traffic. The smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of wet earth and decay. The sun, which had risen with such promise just hours before, now seemed weak, casting a pale, sickly light over the town. The once bright and cheerful streets now felt oppressive, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was thick with dread. Claire moved cautiously through the wreckage, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her mind kept trying to make sense of it, but nothing fit. It was as if the town she had lived in her whole life had been replaced with something twisted, something alien. The houses that were once filled with families, laughter, and the hum of normal life now stood empty and broken. The air was still, save for the occasional groan or distant growl that seemed to come from every corner, every dark alley. The infected were no longer the slow, disoriented wanderers they had been the day before. They had evolved, adapted to the nightmare they were now part of. They moved in groups, shuffling through the streets with a disturbing sense of purpose. There was no more aimless wandering, no more confusion. The undead were hunting now, their eyes blank, but their movements deliberate, coordinated. They didn't need to search for food like they had before. It was as if the hunger was guiding them, driving them forward. They were predators now, and Willowbrook was their prey. As Claire made her way toward the center of town, her breath coming in shallow gasps, she saw the destruction firsthand. The diner, the one place she had often stopped to grab coffee before work, was still standing, but barely. The front door hung off its hinges, and the windows were broken. The signs of a struggle evident in the debris scattered around. She approached cautiously, staying low, but her heart jumped when she saw movement through the cracked window. Inside, a small group of survivors were huddled together, looking just as frightened and desperate as she felt. She knocked softly on the window, tapping with the side of her fist. They looked up, their faces pale and tired, their eyes hollow with fear. One of the survivors, a man Claire recognized from the local hardware store, stood up slowly and made his way to the door. He hesitated before opening it, clearly unsure.
"What happened?"
Claire asked, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Claire could feel the weight of his words settle in her chest like a stone. The infection wasn't contained, wasn't something that could be kept at bay by barricades or makeshift safe zones. It was spreading, like wildfire. It had already claimed more than just their town, and soon it would spread beyond Wisconsin. The man, whose name Claire now remembered as Tom, looked around nervously, his eyes darting to the door and then back to her. "We've been hiding here for hours. We haven't seen anyone else for a while, but it's not safe. It's getting worse." He paused, as if contemplating something. "I think we need to get out. There's a bigger place up north. Maybe we can make it there, but we need to move fast." Claire didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing. She had heard the panic in his voice, seen the desperation in his eyes. They weren't the first survivors to have thought about escaping. Everyone was trying to find refuge, trying to outrun the terror that was closing in on them. But where could they go? The world, as far as Claire could see, had become a death trap. There was no safe zone. There was no place to run anymore. And the infection wasn't just spreading across Willowbrook. It was consuming the whole state. What chance? As if to answer her unspoken thoughts, the ground shook beneath her feet. It wasn't an earthquake, but it was close enough. The sound of distant growls and screams echoed through the town, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of the undead. They were moving, hunting. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she looked out the diner's broken window and saw them, a small group of infected, moving in their direction, their bodies jerking and twitching as they walked. They were closing in, faster than she had anticipated. "Get inside," Tom shouted, pulling Claire into the diner and slamming the door shut behind them. The survivors huddled together, a mixture of fear, confusion, and hopelessness written across their faces. "We need to move now." Claire nodded, her mind still racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But there was no time to waste. The undead were closing in, and they were relentless. No matter where they went, the infected would follow. She didn't have a plan, didn't know where they could go to escape, but she knew one thing for certain. If they didn't act now, they wouldn't make it out alive. The survivors scrambled to grab whatever supplies they had left: food, water, weapons. Claire's hands trembled as she packed her bag, but she didn't let herself slow down. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Every second counted. Outside, the growls of the undead were growing louder. The air felt thick with the tension of impending doom. As Claire glanced around, she noticed a familiar face. Maria, the town's librarian, clutching her daughter to her chest. Maria's eyes met Claire's, filled with fear, but also a sense of determination. Claire could see it in her eyes. Maria wasn't ready to give up. None of them were. "We'll make it," Maria said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "We have to. We can't just let this happen to us." Claire nodded. Though she wasn't sure, she believed it. But there was no time for doubt now. They had to survive. There was nowhere else to go. Nowhere safe. The infection was relentless, spreading like wildfire. If they didn't get out of Willowbrook, they would be just another casualty. Just another pile of bodies to be consumed by the undead. With the door securely bolted, Claire and the others gathered their belongings and prepared to make their escape. They would have to move fast, stick together, and hope that somehow, against all odds, they could outrun the infected. But as they stepped out of the diner and into the wreckage of their once peaceful town, Claire realized just how far the infection had spread. The world had changed. There was no going back. The fire was spreading, and the wind carried the smoke from the nearby city of Madison. In the distance, Claire could see the smoke rising. A grim reminder that the infection was everywhere. No place was safe. The whole state of Wisconsin was on the brink of collapse. The infected had become an unstoppable force, and survival wasn't guaranteed. Not for anyone. But Claire wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She had to keep fighting. She had to keep moving forward. There was still a chance, somewhere, to make it out. But as she glanced back at the burning town, the reality of what lay ahead started to sink in. No one was safe anymore. The infection had spread beyond Willowbrook, and soon it would spread across the country. The world was crumbling, and the undead were winning. With one last look at the town that had once been home, Claire turned and began to run, knowing that this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The world outside the small cabin was nothing like it had been before. Gone were the peaceful sounds of crickets and birds, replaced by the distant growls and moans of the infected. The air, once crisp and fresh, now felt thick with tension and fear. For weeks, Claire and the small group of survivors had managed to carve out a fragile existence in the woods. They had found a secluded cabin deep enough into the forest that they could stay hidden, away from the hordes of the undead that had overrun the towns. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe for the time being. Claire, once a teacher, had become something entirely different. The apocalypse had changed her in ways she never imagined. She had always thought of herself as someone who helped others, who guided them. But now, in this new world, Claire had become a fighter, a protector, and a leader in ways she never wanted to be. She had learned to hunt, to trap, to survive. The teacher, who once stood in front of a chalkboard, had been replaced by a woman who could navigate through the wilderness, wield a weapon, and protect herself and the others from the horrors that lurked outside. But it was never enough. It was never enough to know that at any given moment, everything they had could be ripped away from them. A group had rationed their food and water carefully, and they had only a few weapons left. They had learned that survival in this new world was about managing resources, staying quiet, and remaining hidden. But it was clear that no matter how careful they were, the undead were closing in. It wasn't just the hordes in the towns anymore. It was something worse. Something smarter. The infection was spreading, and it was evolving. They had seen it in the way the infected moved, the way they reacted. It wasn't just random chaos anymore. There was a method to it. A terrifying method. Claire had always been the one to scout the area. She was the one who ventured into the woods to check for supplies or find a safer route. It was risky, but she couldn't sit idly by while the world fell apart. She knew the risks, but they couldn't afford to wait for the danger to come to them. They had to stay ahead of it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the air grew cooler, Claire set out on another scouting mission. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was surrounded by dense forest and steep hills, providing some natural protection. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. She had to be sure. She had to know what was happening beyond the woods. Was the world really as empty as it seemed? Or was there something, someone, out there, organizing the undead? She moved quietly, her boots barely making a sound on the forest floor as she navigated her way through the dense underbrush. The forest felt eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. But there was something else. The air had a heavy, almost oppressive feel to it, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. As Claire pushed forward, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Hours passed as she moved deeper into the woods, the trees becoming thicker, the paths more difficult to navigate. She didn't mind. She was used to it by now. But as she came to a small clearing, something caught her eye. It wasn't the first time she had stumbled across something abandoned. There had been empty cabins, broken vehicles, and ruined farms scattered throughout the woods. But this was different. In the distance, barely visible, through the thick trees, was the outline of an old church. It was strange. Claire had been through this area several times, but she had never noticed it before. The structure was old, its stone walls cracked and weathered by years of neglect. The windows were broken, the once grand doors hanging ajar, as if inviting her to step inside. It looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. Without thinking, Claire moved closer, her steps slow and cautious. She knew that she shouldn't go inside, that she should turn back, report what she found to the others, and be done with it. But curiosity tugged at her. She needed to know. She had to see for herself what was happening in this part of the woods. The infection was spreading, but she didn't know how, or why, or who was behind it. Was this just another abandoned place, or was there something more? She reached the church and hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The door creaked on its hinges as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty building. The inside was dark, the only light filtering in through the broken windows, casting long, distorted shadows on the cold stone floor. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of decay. She stepped carefully, her boots making a soft echo in the otherwise silent space. The pews, once neatly arranged, were now overturned, their wood splintered and broken. The altar at the front of the church was untouched, standing as a silent, ominous reminder of what this place once was. But it wasn't the church's state of decay that unsettled her. It was the figures. At first, she thought she was seeing things, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, She saw them. The infected. But they weren't just wandering aimlessly like the others. No, they were standing together, clustered in a circle in the middle of the church. They were facing inward, their heads bowed, their bodies still, as if they were waiting for something or someone. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she watched them. They were moving now, but it was different. They weren't acting on instinct or hunger. They were coordinated, deliberate. As she moved closer, her foot scraping the floor, one of them, a man with sunken eyes and blood-streaked skin, turned his head toward her. His gaze was vacant, but there was something about it that felt wrong. It wasn't the usual lifeless stare of the undead. It was as if he knew she was there, as if he was aware of her presence. Her heart raced as she stepped back, but her eyes never left the group. The infected continued to stand in their circle, completely unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that she had entered. There was something deeply unsettling about their behavior. They weren't mindless anymore. They weren't just walking corpses, driven by hunger. They were organized. They were waiting for something. Claire turned to leave, but then she saw it. In the shadows at the far end of the church, barely visible, was a figure. It was standing still, its face obscured by the darkness, but Claire could feel its presence. It was watching her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she froze, her breath shallow. The figure stepped forward slowly, revealing its form. It was a man, tall and imposing, wearing a dark robe that hung loosely around his body. His eyes, though shadowed, gleamed with an unsettling intensity. Claire's blood ran cold. It wasn't just the infected she had to worry about anymore. It was him. The one who controlled them, the one who had turned them into a weapon. The figure smiled, his lips stretching in a way that felt wrong. His voice echoed softly through the church as he spoke. "I've been waiting for you." Claire's stomach twisted. She had to get back to her group. She had to warn them. But as she turned to leave, her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She had to know more. She had to understand what was going on here. She couldn't leave without answers. With her heart racing, Claire took a step forward, determined to uncover the truth. But as she stepped closer to the figure, the infected began to stir. The sound of their movements echoed through the church, and Claire realized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that this was no longer just a place of worship. It was a place of control, and the one who controlled them was standing right in front of her. After weeks of tracking and piecing together the fragments of information, Claire's mind had finally started to make sense of the terrifying puzzle that had unfolded around her. The deeper she ventured into the wreckage of their world, the clearer it became. The horror they were facing wasn't just a random outbreak, nor was it some uncontrollable virus that had spread across the land. This was something far more calculated, far darker. A leader of the infected wasn't some lone madman, some forgotten figure who had taken advantage of the chaos to create havoc. No, the man behind it all was someone Claire never expected. It was Johnathan, a man she had heard about only in passing, a name whispered in the small, tight-knit community of Chapel Hill. He had been a preacher, once respected and revered by the townsfolk, known for his fire and brimstone sermons and his devotion to God. But Claire's investigation had uncovered a side of Johnathan that no one had ever suspected. Beneath his facade of holiness and purity, there had been darkness, a darkness that had consumed him completely. Johnathan had been a member of an underground religious cult, one whose beliefs were centered around the resurrection of the dead. He had delved deep into forbidden practices, his obsession with life after death slowly transforming into a twisted, unholy fixation. The resurrection of the dead, he believed, was the key to unlocking eternal life, and he was determined to achieve it. His followers had been his guinea pigs. They were desperate, looking for salvation, for a way to escape the death that loomed over them all. They had willingly subjected themselves to his dark rituals, hoping for rebirth, for resurrection. But what they had not known, what Claire now realized, was that Jonathan's experiments had gone terribly wrong. Instead of bringing the dead back to life in a form that could be controlled, Johnathan had unleashed something far more terrifying, an uncontrollable plague. The dead did not rise as they once were. They were turned into monstrous, mindless creatures, driven only by hunger, a hunger that could never be sated. But there was something worse, a chilling revelation that made Claire's blood run cold. Johnathan had discovered a way to control them. Infection wasn't a mistake. It was a carefully planned outcome. Johnathan had used his twisted power to control the undead, to bend them to his will. He had turned them into his army, using their insatiable hunger as a weapon to spread terror and destruction. This wasn't an accidental outbreak. This was deliberate. And Claire now understood that the infected, the undead, were not mindless monsters. They were tools, weapons, each one serving a purpose in Jonathan's twisted vision of a world that was no longer bound by the laws of life and death. A discovery had rocked Claire to her core. She shared what she had learned with the group of survivors she had found refuge with, but by the time they fully understood the gravity of the situation, it was too late. The undead, under Jonathan's control, had already been drawn to them. It was as if Jonathan's influence reached far beyond what Claire had anticipated. The undead weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore. They weren't just moving toward any noise or signs of life. No, they were following a leader's call, a leader's command. That night, as the survivors sat huddled together in the small cabin deep in the woods, preparing for whatever was coming next. They heard it, the faintest sound in the distance, the soft shuffle of feet against dirt. The groaning and growling of the undead were close. Claire's heart sank. They had been found. She grabbed her rifle, her hands trembling, and motioned for the others to stay quiet. But it was no use. The undead were already here, and they weren't alone. As Claire peered out of the cabin's cracked window, she saw them, shuffling toward the cabin, their numbers growing by the second. But there was something different about them. They weren't the slow-moving, disoriented creatures they had been in the past. These undead were organized, moving in coordinated groups, heading straight for the cabin with terrifying precision. Claire's mind raced. Johnathan's power was far stronger than she had realized. The infected were not just mindlessly following their instincts. They were under his control, marching to his orders. The attack came swiftly and violently. The undead reached the cabin, battering down the walls with a frightening strength. They were relentless, their pale, decayed hands grabbing at anything in their path. Claire fired shot after shot, her heart pounding in her chest, but it felt like she was fighting against an unending wave. For every one she brought down, two more took its place. The group fought with everything they had, but their weapons were limited, their strength dwindling with every passing minute. It wasn't just a zombie attack. It was an assault, a calculated attempt to wipe them out, to crush any hope of survival. As the night wore on, the situation grew worse. The undead were everywhere, breaking through windows, clawing at doors. Claire's group was being overwhelmed. She could hear their screams, some in terror, others in pain, as one by one her friends fell. She fought tooth and nail, trying to hold her ground, but the numbers were too great. She was losing them. They were losing. The air inside the cabin grew thick with the smell of blood and sweat, and the sound of the undead clawing at the walls was deafening. Claire, covered in dirt and blood, looked around the room, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they were not going to survive this. Johnathan's influence, his control over the undead, had turned the tide in his favor. The infected weren't just random, uncontrolled creatures. They were his army, his weapon, and it seemed there was no way to stop them, no way to fight back against someone who could control death itself. The last of her friends fell, and Claire was left alone, the weight of the world pressing down on her. Her rifle was useless now. The infected were inside the cabin, their eyes locked on her, their mouths dripping with hunger. There was nowhere left to run, no place to hide. Claire had fought with everything she had, but in the end, it wasn't enough. Johnathan had won. As the final blow came, Claire's mind flashed to the group she had fought so hard to protect. She thought of her life before all of this, teaching in the classroom, walking through town without fear. She thought of the world they had lost, a world that seemed so distant now, so far out of reach. But before the darkness closed in, before the world she knew slipped away, Claire understood one thing. The undead were not just a plague. They were a weapon, and their leader, Johnathan, was the one pulling the strings. His power was too great, too far-reaching. The infection had spread across the land, and no one was safe. The last hope for humanity had been snuffed out in that cabin, in that final, desperate fight. And as Claire's vision faded, she realized that the fight wasn't just for survival anymore. It was a fight for control of the dead, and Johnathan had won. The woods had become an endless maze, dark and unfamiliar, as Claire stumbled through the underbrush, her hands shaking as they gripped the handgun. The knife, cold and heavy in her other hand, felt like nothing more than a poor defense against the nightmare she was about to face. She had been walking for hours, her feet aching and her mind racing with every step. It had come to this. The final confrontation with Johnathan, the man who had unleashed the nightmare upon the world, the man who had turned the dead into an army, the man who had taken everything from her. Claire had known for a while that this moment was coming. She had seen the destruction, witnessed the carnage, and understood the enormity of the threat. But facing it head on, walking straight into the heart of it all, was something else entirely. It was one thing to fight for survival in the woods, to protect herself and the few survivors she had left. It was another to walk into the den of the beast, to challenge the man who had caused it all, knowing there was a very real chance she would not walk out alive. The old church loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. It was like a twisted monument to the horror that had consumed the world. The windows were broken, the stone walls cracked and weathered by years of neglect. The doors were wide open, as if inviting her in. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the entrance. She had no choice. The infection was spreading. The undead were everywhere. And if she didn't stop Johnathan, if she didn't put an end to this madness, the world, as they knew it, would be lost forever. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the shattered windows. The air inside the church was thick, stale, and heavy with the scent of decay. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the cold stone floor as she moved deeper into the building. It was the silence, the kind of silence that only existed in a place where death had claimed everything. And then she saw him, Johnathan. He was standing at the altar, his back to her, bathed in the dim light from the broken windows above. His posture was straight, almost regal, and there was a strange serenity about him, as though he had already accepted his fate, or perhaps was enjoying the power he had over the dead. But it wasn't just his calm demeanor that caught Claire off guard. It was the way he stood surrounded by the undead, who were motionless, standing like statues, waiting for some unseen command. They didn't shuffle aimlessly like the other infected she had encountered. They were still, silent, as if awaiting his orders. Johnathan didn't turn when Claire entered. He didn't need to. He knew she was there. She could feel his eyes on her, even though he hadn't moved. His presence seemed to fill the room, the air thickening with the power he exuded, a power that Claire knew was unnatural, horrifying. "You came," he said, his voice cold and distant, almost as if they were having a casual conversation. His words sent a chill down her spine. He knew exactly what was coming, and he welcomed it. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, his smile a twisted mockery of warmth. His eyes, though calm, gleamed with a kind of madness that Claire had seen in the eyes of those who had long since lost their humanity. His eyes held the answer to everything she had been searching for. He was the key to the madness that had consumed the world. Claire stepped forward, her feet making soft, deliberate sounds on the stone floor. Every instinct told her to run, to escape this nightmare and save herself. But she couldn't. She had to end this, for the survivors, for everyone who had fallen, and for the future that might still be salvaged. She had to stop him. "Why?" Claire asked, her voice steady, though her hands shook. "Why did you do it? Why bring them back? Why turn them into this?" Johnathan turned slowly, his face serene, but there was something unsettling about the way he regarded her. There was no fear in his eyes, no remorse. Only the cold, unfeeling gaze of someone who had crossed the line into something else entirely. "You don't understand, Claire," he said softly, almost with pity. "The resurrection of the dead is the ultimate act of power. You think this is a curse, but it is a blessing. Death is not the end. It is only the beginning." His words, twisted as they were, made Claire's stomach churn. She could see now more clearly than ever the depth of his delusion. He wasn't just controlling the undead. He was trying to reshape the world, trying to create a new reality, one where death no longer held any power. It wasn't about survival for him. It was about domination, about making himself a god in a world where the living had lost their purpose. "You're wrong," Claire said, taking another step forward, her grip tightening on the handgun. "This isn't life. It's a nightmare. You've turned them into monsters. You've turned yourself into one." Johnathan smiled again, but this time there was a coldness to it, a cruelty in his eyes. "You still don't get it, do you?" His voice was almost kind now, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "The world you knew is gone. There's no place for the weak anymore. The old rules don't apply. I've created something stronger, something eternal. And you're still clinging to the past. Claire's heart raced as she raised the handgun, her finger hovering over the trigger. She knew this was it. She knew this was the moment that would decide everything. The moment where she would either end the madness or become part of it. But she had to act fast. Johnathan's influence over the undead was too strong. He had turned them into soldiers, into weapons, and they would follow his command without question. Before Claire could make her move, the church seemed to come alive. The undead, once motionless, began to stir. Their eyes, once empty, were now fixed on her. They shuffled forward, but it wasn't random. They moved together, coordinated, as though they were following an order. Johnathan had control over them, and now he was using them to trap her. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she backed away. Raising the handgun and firing, the first shot hit one of the undead in the chest, but it didn't stop it. It kept coming. Claire fired again and again, but it was no use. They were too many, and they were too relentless. Johnathan stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her. "You can't win," he said, his voice almost gentle now, as if he were offering her some form of consolation. "I've already won." The church seemed to close in around her, the undead pressing forward like an unstoppable wave. Claire fought with everything she had, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. But the more she fought, the more it became clear there was no defeating him. Johnathan's grip on the undead was too powerful, too absolute. In the end, as the undead closed in, Claire's vision blurred. The final scream she let out was lost to the growing sound of the undead's hungry growls. The church fell silent, save for the faint sound of Claire's last breath, as the world she had known was consumed by the very horror that Johnathan had unleashed. And with that, the world fell. The undead, under Jonathan's control, marched forward, their army growing with every passing moment. No one was left to stand in their way.